If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. Which terrifying, creepy legend turned out to be true? Freddy Krueger is based on a real story. Hear me out. There's a small ethnic group local to Southeast Asia, the Hmong people. They've been oppressed for years by various countries, so they fought with the US during the Vietnam Civil War. As you know, we lost, and the North Vietnamese were gearing up to kill the Hmong people who had fought for the Southern Vietnamese. So the US airlifted a bunch of Hmong families to the US, primarily in California and Minnesota. One of the recent immigrants was a young man. He was perfectly healthy but suddenly died in his sleep. No one knew how he died. It's guessed it was a heart attack, but an autopsy wasn't done. This sent a panic throughout the community. There is a Hmong legend of a spirit that enters your dreams and kills you. Hmong people were terrified. They were also in a new community without access to some old traditions to protect them. Young men started staying awake, trying to avoid the monster. They downed caffeine. They were actually scared enough that it caused stress to their hearts and they died. Eventually, 117 men died from Hmong sleeping sickness. When I was about 12 years old, a friend and I were playing in the woods that were known for being creepy. While building a fort, a strange man snuck up behind us and yelled at us to get off his land and never come back, yada yada. It really startled us as we knew the land was a public area and had never been threatened by an adult before. Several years later we found out he was an actual bank robber, wanted by the FBI for years. We were building our fort a few feet from his stash. I live near a lake and there was an urban legend that there were huge lake monsters near the hydroelectric dam. Most people thought it was just some fisherman's tall tales. We all guessed it was just a twist on the classic The One That Got Away. Turns out divers went into the water behind the dam for a routine inspection to see if there was any damage after months of heavy flooding in the area. Apparently one of the divers got too close to what he originally thought was a large moss-covered rock/boulder until it moved and tried to latch onto the diver's arm. Apparently there are plus/minus 200 pounds catfish behind the dam which thrive on the dead fish that go through the hydroelectric portion of the dam. The agitated water makes it easier for the large catfish to breathe and grow past what is commonly found in the area, and the lack of fishers as all commercial fishing is banned for at least 1,000 meters means these fish are truly free to grow to truly enormous sizes. Black Volga. In the 60s and 70s, there existed an urban legend in Poland that vampires in black limousines were kidnapping people, preferably little children. It was a tale parents told their kids who would then tell their friends, etc. Turns out it was a rumor that was spread by the Polish secret police who actually used black cars to kidnap people. The aim was that no one would believe someone who would report they had witnessed a kidnapping. We had an older couple that would come into the store I worked at when I was 15. They clearly had mental development/mental health problems and the rumor was they were siblings and the two teenage girls with them were their children. About 5 years later I'd find out someone had called the state about them and turns out, from what I remember, to be mostly true. The parents were apparently the result of incest and they carried on the family tradition, as it were. I think the state removed their daughters and put them in state custody since they weren't able to take care of themselves, and I don't remember what happened to the parents. When I was young living rural Ontario we were told as children not to wander too far into the forest saying that a monster would get us and we wouldn't come home. If anybody knows who Rock Terrio is, that actually turned out to be painfully true. I often wonder if Stephen King's Children of the Corn was based on a northern town in Maine. I don't recall the name of the town, but my friends and I stopped in on our way to the furthest US point east. The town struck me very weird because every store clerk was like 14 to 17 max. Not just 1 or 2 stores every store. Aside from ourselves, we did not come across one adult in the 2 or so hours we were there. It was a depressed town, nearly a ghost town, and left me with a really unsettled feeling. Where I live there was a legend about a child and pet eating monster on the east side of town. We called it the Beast from the East. One child was reported missing, multiple pets as well. There was even a mangled up deer found just out on the train tracks in that area, and the trains no longer use that track / it was blocked off so a train couldn't have ran over the deer. There were coyotes out in the woods around town, some, lynx, and maybe even wolverines, so most people assumed those animals were coming into town, to follow the deer that would herd there every fall / spring, and just pick off pets because they were easy prey if not fenced in properly. Well, a few years ago a trapper set up their traps to possibly catch some of these animals for fur and help reduce the amount of missing pets. He ended up snaring a mountain lion. Mountain lions should not exist this far east in Canada as they are considered extinct on the eastern side of Canada and we are only a few hundred, maybe 200-300, miles from Manitoba. Most lions stick close to the Alberta side if they are anywhere in Saskatchewan. So the beast from the east was real, although it was just an elusive big cat. We knew there was an actual monster living near town even though law enforcement / the forest rangers kept saying otherwise. The Asylum Lake tunnels in Kalamazoo are real. There is a small lake and wildlife area just off of WMU's campus, and for a long time there were rumors going around that they were still there and accessible. Well, turns out that was true, and there was an old set of stairs that was partially buried that lead to a walled-up tunnel entrance. A few people used hand tools and ended up breaking part of the wall down and got inside only to find the tunnels fully intact, albeit a bit damp and murky. Somehow the authorities got wind and went and sealed the entrance again, but it's still very obvious where that was if you are really looking for them. There's this road called Whip-Orwile. Apparently it's either haunted or is a nesting ground for KKK, other creepy local cults. There are several articles about it on the internets. Anyway, myself and 2 friends drove there at night, and a big white Bronco came out of nowhere behind us with huge LED lights and tried to drive us off the road. A very narrow dirt road surrounded by dense trees. They were on our ass like making us speed. A big hill came in the road, it's about a mile long and you should be going slow. When we went over the top, the Bronco stayed behind and disappeared. It was intense. I figured they were patrolling for a cult/clan meeting. But there is some truth to that urban legend, that's a fact. When I was a kid, my dad would take me and my brother to High Rock. It's a neat overlook and we could play on the rocks. It was fun, but also a little sobering, as much as things can be for kids, because a girl had died in a hang gliding accident if I remember right. As you drive up to the parking lot for the overlook, the road continues on into the woods. We asked our dad where it went and he told us that you'd be driving down the road and suddenly armed guards would pop out of the woods to stop you because there was a secret government base there. That's the case, except it isn't really secret. It's Raven Rock, which is a nuclear bunker that can act as a remote Pentagon if the country is attacked. Cheney went there during Sept 11 while Bush was taken somewhere else. You will be detained if you trespass on the property. I went back to High Rock a few years ago while visiting family, and while hanging out at the overlook a truck of teenagers showed up. They asked if I knew what was up the access road and I told them Raven Rock and not to keep going because they'd be detained. They decided they wanted to check it out anyway. An hour later when I left High Rock, those kids had not come back yet, so I figured they were getting their asses chewed out by a soldier. Fun fact, Raven Rock is the headquarters of the Enclave in Fallout 3. The North Pond Hermit. Things would go missing in this little vacation community and people attributed it to some mysterious dude. Turned out there was one. He lived out in the woods for 27 years without ever talking to anyone. He said hi to a hiker once during that 27 years. Best friend he ever had. The North Pond Hermit in Maine. Incredible story. A man lived completely alone in the woods of Maine for 27 years. There were urban legends of him because people in surrounding cabins/camps had random small stuff go missing all the time, batteries, packages of food, flashlights, etc. He eventually got caught stealing said items when people became determined to figure it out. There is a book about him, called The Stranger in the Woods. His name is Christopher Knight. Look it up, it's really interesting. The Werewolf of Hanover, Germany in the 1920s started as a legend who had some truth to it, but it's definitely creepy though. Teenage boys disappeared, and soon there was a legend about a werewolf who killed them. Turns out it was the serial killer Fritz Harman who bit his 24 young victims over the throat. He first lured them with goods because times were hard after World War I, then after abusing them sexually and killing them by biting, he cut their bodies and sold the meat to the people of Hanover as food, without them knowing what it really was. Fritz was as close to a werewolf a human can get. My stepbrother is 1 year younger than me, and growing up he lived with his mother in Christiansburg, Virginia. When we were about 12-13, he told me that kids in town claimed that his middle school was haunted by 3 witches called the Black Sisters. This sounded pretty generic. I just assumed it was a dumb story middle schoolers made up from scratch. Imagine my surprise when as an adult I found a book compiling ghost stories of Virginia, and contained within was the true tale of the murderous Black Sisters. Turns out the middle school is built on the site of the old Montgomery Female Academy, which they were affiliated with. The Green Man/Charlie No Face. On the outskirts of Pittsburgh, near where Piney Fork empties into Peters Creek, there's an old neglected railroad tunnel covered in graffiti and filled with road salt. It was built in 1924 as the Piney Fork Tunnel to service coal mines along the Pennsylvania Railroad's Peters Creek branch. Abandoned since 1962, the locals have given it another nickname. To many people in the Pittsburgh area, this is Green Man Tunnel. Teenagers used to drive into the tunnel, turn off their lights, and call out to the Green Man, who would appear from the darkness. his skin tinged green from a tragic electrical accident. If he touched your car, his electrical charge would either stall the vehicle or make it difficult to start. Teenagers looking for a good scare still head out to the area at night hoping to catch a glimpse of the Green Man, but they won't find him. He passed away over 20 years ago. But he wasn't a crazed lunatic or ghostly apparition. His name was Raymond Robinson. When I was in elementary school, there were rumors that a satanic cult operated in the woods behind the school. The forest was pretty shady, because homeless people lived in it, and local teenagers get up to shenanigans like burning down the wooden beam bridges. Because of this, most parents told their kids to stay away from the woods, and most kids were afraid to go into the woods. Kids at the school started saying that the satanic cult skinned stray cats alive and sacrificed people they caught wandering in the woods at night. One day someone found a satanic summoning circle in a clearing, with the parts of baby dolls cut up and hung in the trees, covered in blood. Police were called, and it turned out that the blood was fake, but they never figured out who did it. Recently I found out that a photography student who had gone to my high school years prior had created it. He set it up for a photography shoot. He had taken pictures during the night, and had planned to go back in the morning to clean it up, but before he got around to it the police had already arrived and he decided it wasn't worth the hassle. I grew up near a small townish area known as Lake Eliza. It's mainly comprised of redneck homes grouped around said lake. The story was when the area was first established, the lake was originally named Fish Lake. There was a couple that owned one of the first houses to be built along the lake. Before being able to start a family, the husband died from unknown causes. The wife, Lady Eliza, grew very depressed after the passing of her husband. The only time anyone would see her is when she would take her dog out for a walk on the lake during wintertime when everything was frozen over. One of the times she never returned from her walk. When locals went searching for her, they had found a hole at the center of the lake, where she had presumably fallen under. They then changed the name of the lake to Lake Eliza in memoriam. Over the years her house remained the only one still standing. It's now directly across from the town hall and has a nice path down to the lake. A lot of people claim the house to be haunted by her ghost, which is fun. That's not the real urban legend though. It is, however, the urban legend that drew me and my friends into checking it out. My friends and I, in our teens, were obsessed with ghost hunting. We checked out all the haunted places in our area. Gypsy's Graveyard, Circus Train Wreck, Salesian Prep School, we even looked for Diana of the Dunes. We partied at all the sites and never saw a thing. Nothing fazed us, until we went to Lady Eliza's house. We went out there at night, there was 6 of us. A few stayed behind in the car that were too chicken to check it out. Me and 3 other friends decided to check the house out. The front door was boarded up, but we noticed a nearby window was exposed. We climbed in through the window and immediately the smell hit us. We were not quiet about it, which in hindsight was very dumb. We ventured in through the living room. One of my friends decided to wander and nobody thought anything of it. He didn't get very far. From the edge of the living room was a staircase and a hallway, and across from that the kitchen. My friend took one look in the kitchen and turned pale. He shined his flashlight at us to get our attention and said, "We have to go, now." Our first reaction was to laugh at him, but the chance to mock him was quickly interrupted by a "what the duck?" that came from upstairs. We booked it out, jumped into the waiting car and told them to GTFO. While driving away we noticed an Escalade that came from the opposite direction pull up to the house. Lake Eliza is also not too far of a drive from a city that we'll just say used to hold the murder record in the United States. The rumor was that gangbangers would take victims to this house and drop them there. We didn't hear about this rumor until after the encounter. What my friend saw, and what I swear I caught a glimpse of while we were leaving, was several dead bodies lined up across the kitchen floor. We had stumbled upon the gangbangers at the worst possible time. The house may not have been haunted, but it sure as hell scared the piss out of me and my ghost debunker friends. From then on, my friends and I have a natural distrust for Escalades and will ridiculously duck and hide if we see one cruising by. Nebo Mountain, maybe 15 miles from where I grew up in East Tennessee. All the rumors say it's basically a hellish Appalachian hillbilly nest, and there are stories of trees felled on cop cars and flaming tires rolled at passers-by. Didn't believe it until a friend and I drove up one afternoon. We didn't see anything too unusual until close to evening when we had stopped to talk about what we were going to do next, when my friend looks past me out the window and says, "Holy shit," really softly. I turn and after a second of searching I see this young guy, shirtless, crouched by the road just looking at our car. When he sees us both looking at him he gets up, calm as hell, and just walks into the woods. We start to book it out of there, and just as we come around the first bend down the mountain this giant rock barrels onto the road 10 or 15 feet in front of us, then on down the mountain. Absolutely terrifying. So this is just in my experience, not some kind of proven fact I guess, though I would love for someone to figure it out because it's terrifying. There's a bridge near where I grew up in Bumduck, Tennessee that is notorious for screaming at people at night. The screams aren't audible to the houses nearby and supposedly you have to sit on the actual bridge to hear it at all, though I personally haven't tested it or anything. The common explanation is that it's a bobcat that lives under the bridge, but people have checked with dogs and such and never find signs of any. Well, some friends and myself had heard this story for years all growing up but never tested it. So one night after a few beers we get up the notion we're going to go test the thing. So 5 drunk guys pile into a beat-up car and we drive down and park on the bridge. This is 1:30 a.m. and it's dead silent out. We sat there for a good 45 minutes and nothing happened. We had the windows down and had started debating whether or not it was all bullshit when the scream happened. We had the lights off and there was a moon so you could see pretty well and there for sure wasn't anything outside the car, but it was ducking loud and it sounded just like a woman with particularly powerful lungs having her skin ripped off right outside the window on the rear passenger side that faced off the edge of the bridge. Now I've heard bobcats in heat while hunting and they do like a scream kind of thing. It's hard to describe but they do it in little repeating bursts. This was a good 3 to 4 seconds extended scream at incredible volume. We tore out of there like a demon was chasing us. A couple of miles down the road we finally stopped and actually processed what happened. My adrenaline was going so badly and I was so scared I was just shaking uncontrollably. One of my friends had actually pissed himself, which I'd never seen anyone actually do. One friend immediately left the car and vomited. To give what I think was a good frame of reference to how actually terrifying this was, my friend whose car we were in wasn't even mad at the friend that pissed all over his seat. It was insane. To this day I have no explanation for it. I don't think this is a well-known urban legend or if it's considered one, but one of my best friends went to college up in eastern Ohio, and claimed that there was this back road out in the woods/mountains where really weird things would happen to your car. I was up there visiting one weekend and we decided to go get some snacks and drinks. Some of our other friends came with us. This was probably 1 a.m. or so. On the way back, we made a detour to go drive on the road my friend had told us about. We were driving along for almost the entire length of this road and nothing had happened. Then, right as we pulled up to the stop sign at the end of the road to head back, the engine shut off, all the interior lights came on, and the doors slid open. It was a Ford minivan. Naturally we were freaking out, but after we calmed down a bit, we decided to loop back and try it again. After doing this twice, we discovered that it would only happen if the vehicle came to a complete stop. If we did a slow and go at the stop sign, nothing happened. I still have no explanation for this and haven't seen anything about it online. Crazy stuff. I'll share a story from my high school years, a story among my own friends, a personal urban legend. It's semi-true in that our idea of what happened was sort of a bastardization of the true story. So while it's not true, it's also not a story that turned out to be a completely fabricated bunch of crap, either. There was this old mansion that we all said was haunted. It was the kind of place where teenagers would try to break in on Halloween. It was a seriously messed up place. It looked like an old mental institution, with bars on the windows, and the front yard was all run down. At the back was a huge built-in greenhouse, all glassed in, that overlooked the little bay/inlet there. Anyway, you didn't have to hear stories about it, true or otherwise, to get the sense that this wasn't a happy place or a place you wanted to be. Various people lived there at various points during the time I was aware of it, and the story I heard was during at least some of this period. People lived there for free, they only had to maintain the house and I guess pay utilities. Even still, people never lasted long. We like to think it was because it was haunted, but in reality, it was probably because the place was a dump and the kinds of people you'd get to be caretakers of your creepy dump of a mental institution are probably not the most reliable/sober/etc. Anyway, the story we used to tell among ourselves, not the actual truth, was that the guy who'd lived there had picked up a few hitchhikers, like in their teens or early 20s, and let them stay at his house. He turned out to be a psychopath, though, and ended up brutally butchering them all with a knife, largely in the greenhouse section, leading to this terrible image of a poor innocent victim being hunted among tall plants, with no real escape. The real story was that the man who'd lived there did pick people up and bring them home, notably young men from the gay district, and that he was a pretty awful guy, but it was the young men who killed him, with the knife, in the front hall, a la Clue. I wanted the real story back then, but without the internet, it was hard. I figured I'd have to go find microfilm of it or some shit. Now I can Google it. There are photos of the crime scene, blood and stuff written on the walls, all that. This one is from my village in India. Nishirdak. Apparently there is something that called people by their given name at night. It could call only twice for some reason. And if you would answer the call, you would find yourself walking into the nearby woods and people would find your horribly mutilated corpse later. This, whatever it was, turned out to be true. However, no one found the serial killer. A holy man came to our village and performed a big ceremony with much pomp and show. Strangely, the murders stopped. The last victim was a brave woman who had been waiting with a sharpened sickle to kill the bastard. Her husband had died that way, to the fiend's call. However, we found her corpse the next day. She was not abused sexually. Just strangled to death. The holy man visited our village soon after. Even today, when I go back home to my family in India, we are told to strictly adhere to the following rules. 1. Don't answer immediately when someone calls your name from outside at night. 2. The fiend can only call twice. A human will call thrice or more. Answer only then. I went back home this January 2018. And according to reports, the fiend is still active. But it only kills pets now. I live in a lower/middle suburb in a large city in Middle America. Plenty of religious people, but for whatever reason not many superstitious people. My buddy grew up in the nicest neighborhood in the suburb with his parents, and always jokingly talked about the lights in the haunted house across the lake. He was a huge jokester and nobody ever took him serious enough to even ask for an explanation. Was at his house working on a project one night and he says something like, "The lights are going again." I asked for clarification, and he points toward the window and at a house across the small lake on a hilltop. I had seen the house many times previously, and although it was on the same small lake his house sat on, the entrance to the property was actually from another direction, probably a mile away. I asked what was significant about the lights. He said there was a house fire 5 years prior and gutted a large portion of the interior, while killing the family that slept. He said the house hadn't been remodeled, and it didn't have power. Probably a year later, a small group of us were a little intoxicated one Saturday night and decided to go visit the house and find out once and for all if it had power. We endlessly debated this, because it wasn't flashlights you occasionally saw, it was truly a lit house. The property had a very long and windy drive from the road, probably a mile or so, and the property was unkept, so the grass was probably 4 feet tall or so. As we got probably halfway to the house, in a vehicle, thank God, we encountered a very aggressive wolf standing in the middle of the road who seemingly didn't want us to pass. It was extremely alarming because none of us had seen a wolf up close and it just wasn't something you expected to encounter so close to a big city. After some light flashing and engine revving, we were able to scare it away. We arrived at the house, which was completely trashed and unkept, without further incident. The home had clearly been broken into previously because the door hung from its hinges and was easy to push aside. The inside was incredibly creepy because not only was it an abandoned house, but was just as it had been when the fire swept through and we all knew the inhabitants had died feet from where we were standing. We looked around for a bit and then remembered our original mission, power. We gathered around what appeared to be an undamaged switch and mostly undamaged part of the home. We flipped the switch, and nothing. Immediately, we all made eye contact because we were all feeling the same thing. The best way to describe it was an ice-cold wave of dread and almost hatred ran over all of us. It was almost a repulsed feeling, and we felt that we shouldn't be there. Without hesitation we walked to the door and left. I'm not really superstitious or anything like that, not even religious. But there was something in that house, and it didn't want us there. We never really talked about it again and definitely didn't tell anyone else. I had almost forgotten about it until I visited my friend who was in town visiting his parents a few months ago. I shit you not, the ducking lights were on in that house. There was a road a couple of miles from me just called the Graveyard Road. Urban legend was that there were hundreds of tombs out in the woods overgrown and forgotten about. A few people went missing over the years, and the legend was that ghouls would pull them into the tombs and they would be stuck until they died. Talking maybe 10 to 15 people over 50 years. A couple of my buddies got curious and set out one day to look. They found these lost tombs, with bodies in them. Then they found one with more modern clothing that hadn't decayed completely yet. Turns out the story was true. People were going out and getting lost. I guess they would go in these tombs and get trapped. The entrances were weird and the inside of some could get blocked. 7 bodies of suspected wanderers were found out there. Turk Man. In Scotia, New York, there's an urban legend of a deranged man who for some reason was called Turk Man. Legend has it that one night, his wife and kid were killed on their countryish road by a drink driver in a red car. So every night, Turk Man patrols the road looking for red cars and the driver who killed his family. Funny thing is, my friend had a red car. One night we were high and decided to drive down the road to see if the rumor was true. We drove slowly, and passed by without seeing anything. The road is dark and flanked by nothing but woods and the occasional house. On our second pass, we saw someone. It was a man, wearing what looked to be a really short cut-off shirt, long hair, and he was carrying what looked like a giant stick. He had a hills have eyes type of look to him. We knew it had to be him. We slowed down, brave enough to try to say hi or something. That's when he immediately started charging at us. The stick was actually a shotgun. We peeled out probably as fast as we could in that little red Honda. I turned around and all I saw behind us in the darkness was the man sprinting full speed after us. It was definitely Turk man, and we finally knew the stories were true. I never went down that road again since that night. When I was in high school, my freshman year history teacher told us that when she was growing up in the area, there were rumors of satanic cults. She told the class that they even had some sort of temple or something that got taken down. I don't think anyone really believed her. The high school was in a pretty affluent suburb of Eel. Years later, during the summer I had graduated from high school. I was at a friend's house and we decided to check out the woods in his backyard, because he said there was an abandoned shed back there. We found the shed had been severely damaged by storms over the years. As we kept walking we ended up on a dead-end street lined with houses. The last two houses on the street were boarded up and clearly not occupied. One of those houses had a window open in the back with a small step stool placed under it. I was curious to see what was inside, so I climbed through the window while my friend waited outside. The window I climbed in through was a bedroom window. The walls of the bedroom were covered in graffiti. It was very vulgar. At first I thought it was just a bunch of religion-hating kids, because Jesus and God came up a lot in the vulgar graffiti. As I made my way through the house I went first into a bathroom down the hall. The bathroom was also covered in the same vulgar graffiti, but it also had torn up pieces of paper littering the floor. When I picked some of the paper up I noticed that they were all pages of the Bible. I left the bathroom and went into the living room and there was a huge pentagram spray painted on the wall, in addition to the vulgar graffiti that seemed to be on every wall of the house. At that point I got my friend, who was waiting outside, to come in. He was in shock that this house was so close to his and he wasn't really up for exploring, but I wanted to keep looking around. Eventually we found an attic. I went up the steps to the attic. In the attic there was a goat's, I'm assuming it was a goat, skull on the floor of the attic in the middle of another painted pentagram. After seeing that, we both left the house. A couple months later it was demolished. I just found out that La Llorona is actually not an urban legend, and a completely true story. I don't know how much of the part of her touching kids' faces in the night is true, but there is actually a crazy woman who drowned her kids. Back in the 80s there was a rumor that a satanic cult was holding sacrificial rituals around Old Rag Mountain, Virginia. Attempted kidnapping and lots of dead animals. My mom and dad went hiking up there with my mom's redneckish brother and friends. During the night my mom woke up and saw 3 hooded dudes looking down at her from her tent's mesh top. She screamed her head off and the guys ran off when they heard the hammer of half a dozen guns get cocked in the other tents. Apparently they were just weirdos. No one was ever hurt besides the sadistic ducks sacrificing random animals and drawing cringy satanic symbols on rocks. I grew up in a small rural town in the south. There used to be a dirt road out in the middle of the woods known as Creepy Hollow. It was a stretch of road about 2 or 3 miles long. It was only a few miles outside of town, but it was isolated enough that when you were out there, you felt alone. No street lights, no houses, no sounds from town, nothing but trees and eeriness. It was known that all kinds of strange things happened out there, hence the name Creepy Hollow. I personally have been out there with friends around 2 or 3 in the morning and heard chainsaws running nearby, with no visible light anywhere around, and at other times I've heard chains rattling and clanking around nearby out there. Others have claimed to see UFO-type lights in the sky out there, but I never saw any of those myself. Anyway, there was one particular ghost story about that place that goes back at least a couple of generations. Many people claim to have seen it. Even the town mayor swears he saw it when he was a teenager in the early 70s. There used to be an old bridge on that dirt road. One of those old-timey wooden plank with iron railing type bridges. It crossed over a creek. The water, unless flooded, was usually around 15 feet below the bridge. It was always freaky driving across this old wooden thing as it creaked and groaned as you inched your car across it. I always thought it heightened the experience of being scared out there, and I used to love going across it, lol. But for decades there has been this one ghost story about the bridge. People swear as they were going across it, they would see the ghost of a teenage boy standing near a giant tree just on the other side of the bridge. They call it a ghost because he's just standing there staring at them, and he has no legs. At least no one can ever make out legs on the figure. Some have seen him during the day, others at night in their headlights. No one that saw him ever had the nerve to stop and get out of the car and see what was up. They all freaked out and drove off. Well, about 20 years ago, long after the story had been going around for decades, a car full of teenagers were going down the dirt road, drinking, and they got to the bridge and somehow missed the bridge and drove into the creek. One guy drowned. And it turns out the guy that drowned didn't have the use of his legs, and was wheelchair bound. Shortly after that, the county closed off both entrances to Creepy Hollow and tore down the bridge out there, so there is no way to access the area anymore. About 5 years ago I was back home and a few friends and I tried to find the old dirt road on foot, to walk down it. But after 20 years of growth it seems the forest has completely overtaken the old road. We knew exactly where it used to be, but at the point we went back out there you couldn't tell there was ever a dirt road there. It kind of sucks. The newer generations will only hear the old stories and never get to experience Creepy Hollow for themselves like the generations of townsfolk did before them. The Bunnyman Bridge, which is somewhat true. Back in 1903, deep in Clifton, there used to be an asylum buried deep within the wilderness of Clifton. Pretty soon after the Civil War people started inhabiting the area, population-wise around 300 or so. It was a very small town. Nonetheless, people didn't like the idea of having an asylum miles down the road, so they all got together and signed a petition for the asylum to relocate elsewhere. The petition passed and a new asylum was built, which is now known as Lorton Prison, a temporary facility for convicts to stay in until they are appropriately sentenced. In the autumn of 1904, the convicts were gathered and piled into the bus, used to transport them to Lorton. Somewhere during the drive not too far from where they left, the driver had swerved to avoid something and the bus had started to tip, and soon was rolling in a terrible collision course. Most of the convicts were injured, but managed to escape the bus and had fled into the night towards the woods. The next morning, a local police investigation had begun, and they begun rounding up the escaped convicts. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, weeks into months. Everyone was recovered after 4 months except for 2 people, named Marcus A. Walster and Douglas J. Griffon. During the search for both men, the police found dead rabbits, all of them half-eaten and dismembered, every now and then along their search. Finally, they were to find Marcus dead by the Fairfax Station Bridge, now known as Bunnyman's Bridge. In his hand, he held a man-made hammer/knife-like tool, made with a sharp rock and a sturdy branch as a handle. They thought nothing of it, and didn't care how he died, only that he was apprehended and they no longer had to worry about him. They had a name for Marcus, but later on they would realize they had named the wrong person the Bunny Man. Still searching for Douglas, they kept on finding dead half-eaten rabbits every so often while the search went on. Eventually, they were to name Douglas the Bunny Man from then on. Months passed by and the police gave up their search. Everybody assumed the Bunny Man was dead by now, if not gone, so they went on with their small town lives. Come October, people started seeing dead bunnies reappearing out of the blue, and starting to fear the unseen. Halloween night came around, and as usual, a bunch of kids had gone over to the bridge that night to drink and do whatever kids their age in the early 20th century did. Midnight came around within minutes, and most of the kids had left. Only 3 of them remained at the bridge. Exactly at midnight, a bright light came from the bridge, right where the kids were. A few seconds later, they were all dead. Throats slashed with that same type of tool that was found next to the other escapee, Marcus. Not only were their throats slashed, but they were cut up and down their chests, gutted like fish. The Bunny Man then hung both of the boys from one end of a bridge with rope around their necks, hanging from the overpass with their legs dangling in view of any passing cars. The girl was hung the same way, on the other side of the bridge. This happened on Halloween in 1905. After that, they didn't see or hear anything from him for another year. Halloween 1906 was approaching, and parents as well as the teens in Clifton still remember the incident that had occurred 1 year ago at the Bridge's Bridge, the Bunnyman's Bridge. That night, 7 teens were left remaining right before midnight at the bridge. Thinking little of it, 6 remained inside the bridge while 1, Adrian Hattala, had remained a good distance from the bridge hoping to have enough time to escape if the same thing happened again. She was the only one to witness this, a dim light walking the railroad track just before midnight, stopping right above the bridge at midnight, then disappearing at the same time that a bright flash was inside the bridge. She heard the deafening sounds of terrified screaming coming from inside the bridge that lasted only seconds. Moments later, they were all hung from the edge of the bridge, in the same way as the corpses a year earlier. Horrified, she ran home, and refused to tell all of what she saw, just spattered words mixed with incoherent mumblings that the people of her town had to put together to come up with her story. No one understood it or believed her. They charged her with the teens' murders, and locked her up in the Asylum of Lorton. In 1913, the same thing happened with 9 teenagers this time, on a Halloween night once again. Adrian was still locked up. They dropped her sentence, but it was too late. The insanity had finally conquered her. Even if she was released, she was too far gone to have a life, so she spent her remaining years in the asylum until she finally died in 1953 of reported shock. No one knows what exactly she died of shock from, but supposedly she had died in her sleep, dreaming of that one dreaded night. Perhaps the Bunnyman had finally gotten to her. More murders were to take place, however, although after the murders in 1913, most people stayed clear of the bridge on Halloween. 1943 rolls around and 6 teenagers go strolling out on Halloween night. A couple hours later, all of them dead, same way as all the others. Investigations took place, but as usual nothing was discovered. 1976, the same situation occurs, this time with only 3 people. The only other incident that occurred since then was in 1987, 12 years ago. Janet Chartier was enjoying the night with her 4 friends. Halloween night had finally come, and they had gone driving out to enjoy the night after invading the children's candy bags. They had settled around 11 p.m. at the bridge, waiting for midnight to come. They didn't believe in the myth, so they decided to see it for themselves, and were to be the only ones who actually withstood the Bunnyman. They had waited around an hour or so it was nearly midnight, when Janet started getting a little scared. They all had been pulling pranks on each other, jumping out the bushes and screaming, so she was already a little worked up. Midnight hits, and by this stage she is in a total panic. She's almost out of the bridge when the lights get really bright inside. When that happens, her body is halfway outside of the bridge. She sees her skin start tearing at her chest, but nothing is piercing her skin. She manages finally to leave the bridge. Completely horrified, she hits a hanging body and knocks herself out. When she awakens, she discovers that she has been bleeding. She was lucky that the cut had just started, and wasn't very bad at all. She left and never returned to the bridge again. She has been seen sitting on a swinging bench on her balcony every morning, just staring in the direction towards the bridge a couple of miles down. From then on, the story remains untouched and unmoved. Bloody Mary. About 25 years ago I tried it with a girl. The closet we tried it in was pitch black. We stared into the mirror, looking where one would see their own reflection. Of course, it's pitch black, you can't see a thing in the dark. Slowly a figure shifted into view, as if light were suddenly allowing my reflection to show, though it was not my face. I'll never forget it. Sunken eyes, like a corpse, withered skin, no teeth, but when I moved my face, not sure why, I noticed the reflection followed my actions as if it were my face. It was too dark for any light to allow anything to be seen, and I spent the next year of my life unable to walk by a mirror without triple checking and keeping eye contact until I passed it. I remember as we both exploded out of the closet together, we were trembling, and my skin/body felt tingly like I'd been shocked lightly. Jamie, the girl, was bawling and blubbering, but eventually described what I saw without me prompting her. I don't believe in BS, I'm not a fan of lies and can't stand bullshit stories people make up for attention. However, I have years of experience dealing with the occult because of this one attempt to experiment. I've gone on to deal with some really nasty things, and to this day am not a stranger to, whatever they are. All I know is they don't need the night to go bump. They are the night. This manifestation, in my opinion, wasn't necessarily the Bloody Mary, but an invocation did occur, and what I saw still scares me to this day. Can't remember the name of it, but there is this railroad crossing near where I live in Oklahoma that a school bus full of children got ran into and they all died. The rumor was you could come to a stop on the tracks and put your car in neutral, and even though you were heading uphill your car would still roll forward. Also, if you put dirt or flour on the back of your car, you would be able to see the kids' handprints. So in high school, me and a couple of friends took some girls out there and we put flour on the back of my excursion, and sure enough we rolled up the hill and tiny handprints were on the back of my car. Needless to say, we got the F out of there and haven't been back since. A tad creepy, but all in all a cool experience though. I went to a university near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It used to be a POW camp and a military hospital before the college bought the entire property for $1 in the 1960s. Since there are really only 3 universities near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, it will not be hard to deduce which college it was. Lol. Anyways, there was a rumor that underground tunnels and all sorts of stuff was left abandoned in the abandoned sections of the college. Sure enough, it was true. We found a tunnel hatch under our carpet in our dorm room, 2 hatches on the first floor, furthest most first floor dorm room of each building. It was literally like stepping into 1945. Everything was preserved down there and the tunnels were massive. We eventually ended up in an underground garage where there were 4 Jeeps parked, but all the tires had dry rotted. We realized this was actually beneath our soccer field. Anyways, the tunnels lead to the cafeteria, the admin building, every dorm, and then an old abandoned section of our campus that we had no way of entering topside. We soon realized this was the hospital/morgue. When we got out of the tunnels and walked the floor, it was still like 1945. All the hospital beds were still there, the surgical curtains were still there. Hell, even the tools, like the scalpel, saw, pliers, etc., were still on their trays. It was like everyone all of a sudden up and left and nothing had been moved since then. The morgue still had its slabs and sometimes we would dare each other to slide in there for a period of time. But yeah, it was an urban legend on campus until 3 of us decided to risk expulsion to see if it was true. And it was. The Satanic Panic was somewhat real. At least in my area of South Texas. After the discovery of the gruesome site across the border in Matamoros, Mexico, the area went into a panic with supposed followers of a mix of Palo Mayombe and Santeria threatening to kidnap and sacrifice local school children. I was 9 at the time and schools in the area would corral us into cafeterias and gyms and force parents to head to schools and sign us out in person. A local church called the Church of Fire was burned down because it was thought to be a satanic church. It was a Christian church. On March 14, 1989, University of Texas at Austin student Mark Kilroy was kidnapped in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico, while vacationing during spring break. He was taken by his abductors to a ranch where he was tortured and sodomized for hours before being murdered in a human sacrifice ritual. Kilroy was killed with a machete blow and then had his brain removed and boiled in a pot. His killers then inserted a wire through his backbone, chopped off his legs, and buried him at the ranch along with 14 other people who had been killed there before him. Adolfo Constanzo, the leader of the cult, told his followers that human sacrifice granted them immunity from law enforcement for their drug smuggling operations. The killing drew worldwide media attention and initiated an international police manhunt because of the unusual circumstances of the crime.